The Stranger by the Frozen Lake. I've always loved camping in the winter, especially around Christmas. The snow muffles everything, and there's a quiet that makes the forest feel untouched. That Christmas of 2020, I learned just how wrong quiet can be. I was 26, working remotely at the time, and decided to escape the city for a few days. I picked a small, remote campground with a frozen lake about 4 hours from my apartment. I arrived on December 23rd around 3:10 p.m. The lake was completely frozen, snow covering the ice, and the surrounding woods were dense, quiet, and foreboding. No other campers were in sight. I set up my tent near the lake by 4:30 p.m., gathered firewood, and lit a small fire. The air was sharp, biting at my cheeks, and every exhale came out in thick white clouds. The forest was so silent I could hear every creak of the trees, every crunch of snow beneath my boots. The isolation was exactly what I wanted, or so I thought. By 7 p.m., darkness had fallen completely. I sat near my fire eating a small dinner, the snow reflecting the firelight in a dull glow. That's when I noticed something odd, footprints along the lake, leading toward my campsite. They were fresh. I froze. The snow had been untouched when I arrived. "Hello," I called, my voice barely carrying over the cold air. No answer. I thought maybe it was another camper or someone hiking nearby, but the tracks weren't deep. They seemed to glide over the snow. They led directly toward my fire and then stopped abruptly near my tent. My pulse quickened. Around 8:45 p.m., I crawled into my tent to warm up and read a book. That's when I heard a faint voice outside. "Excuse me?" It called softly. I froze. The tone was calm, friendly even. I whispered, "Who's there?" Silence. Minutes later, the voice came again. Closer this time. "I'm just walking by," it said. "Do you mind if I warm up by your fire?" My stomach dropped. The voice sounded normal, but there was something about the timing that made my skin crawl. I hadn't seen anyone, and the shadows beyond the firelight were thick and impenetrable. I stayed perfectly still. At 10:15 p.m., the voice returned, this time accompanied by movement in the snow, soft crunches circling my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked outside. No one was there. The fire flickered, throwing shadows across the trees, and then I saw it. A figure on the frozen lake, a silhouette against the pale snow. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, slowly, almost floating across the ice. My hands trembled, gripping the flashlight. The figure's head was down, and its arms hung unnaturally at its sides. "Come out," the voice said, soft and calm, now coming from the direction of the ice. "It's safer if you come out." I shook my head, panic rising. "No. Stay back." The figure stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence and the soft hiss of the wind through the trees. Then it began moving toward me again, slow and deliberate, without a sound other than the ice beneath its feet, or whatever it was standing on. By 11:50 p.m., I realized I couldn't stay. I grabbed my backpack and ran to my car, boots slipping on the snow and ice. My flashlight caught the figure again. It was closer than before, and I could see the faint outline of a human face. Pale and expressionless, almost like a mask. It didn't move like a person. It slid across the ice, gliding effortlessly toward the trees. I reached my car at 12:02 a.m., Christmas morning, and drove off without stopping. My hands shook violently, my pulse still racing hours later. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. No footprints, nothing. I told a ranger about it a week later. He listened quietly, then said, "You're not the first. People sometimes see things near that lake, especially around Christmas. We don't know why. I haven't camped alone on Christmas since, and whenever I see a frozen lake, I remember that silhouette gliding silently across the ice, waiting, patient, for the next person who thought the woods were safe." The cabin that sang Christmas. I thought I knew what fear was, but nothing prepared me for that Christmas night in 2021. I'll never forget the smell of smoke, the crack of frozen logs, and the way the forest seemed to close in around me. What I experienced was something I still can't explain, and I'm not sure I ever will. I was 29, working a demanding office job, and needed a real escape for Christmas. I found a small, isolated cabin deep in the national forest about 4 hours from my city. The cabin had no electricity, no cell signal, and a wood-burning fireplace. Perfect, I thought. Perfect peace. I arrived on December 24th around 3:25 p.m. The snow was deep, more than a foot in some places, and falling steadily. The sky was a dull gray, the sun dipping behind the tall pines. My car crunched through the snow as I drove down the narrow trail, the forest closing in on me. There was no one else in sight, not a single vehicle, not a sound beyond the wind in the trees. The cabin itself was small and weathered, made of logs darkened by age. Smoke curled from the chimney, though the fireplace had been cold for weeks. The air smelled of damp wood and pine, but there was something else, a faint metallic tang, sharp and bitter, that made my stomach twist. I shrugged it off as imagination. By 5 p.m., the cabin was set up. I chopped wood, lit the fireplace, and prepared a simple meal. Outside, the snow reflected the firelight in soft glows, creating long, shifting shadows. I tried to relax, but the forest felt wrong, silent in a way that wasn't peaceful, pressing, heavy. At 7:10 p.m., the first sound came, a soft note, high-pitched, almost musical, like a bell or a chime, but coming from inside the forest. Then another, and another. I froze. The fire cracked, but the sound didn't stop. It was rhythmic, deliberate, closer now, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and checked the perimeter. Snow-covered ground, untouched. No footprints. Nothing. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or ice shifting, but the sounds had a pattern. Someone or something was walking slowly around my cabin, playing a melody with metal bells. By 8:45 p.m., I was in bed. The temperature had dropped dramatically. I could see my breath inside the cabin. I zipped the sleeping bag tightly around me and tried to focus on reading, but I couldn't. The sounds persisted, bell-like tones, interspersed with low murmuring whispers. Then came the singing. At 10:23 p.m., a voicemail, slow, eerily calm, sang a Christmas carol from directly outside my window. The tune was familiar, Silent Night, but it wasn't melodic. It was off, wrong. Notes stretched unnaturally, repeated in odd sequences. I froze, heart hammering. The voice was close, enough that I could smell the icy breath, the damp fabric of clothes, the faint metallic odor. I whispered, "Who's there?" The singing stopped. Silence pressed against the cabin like a heavy blanket. My pulse thundered in my ears. By 11:50 p.m., the voice had returned, and it wasn't alone. There were others, dozens of voices now, overlapping, uneven, echoing from all directions. I felt paralyzed, like the forest itself was holding me still. My flashlight flickered and went out. The fire sputtered violently, as if reacting to something unseen. Then, at exactly midnight, the singing changed. It became a chorus, each voice perfectly coordinated but horrifyingly unnatural. It came from inside the cabin. I jumped out of bed. Every muscle in my body screamed to run. I grabbed a fire poker and edged toward the door. That's when I heard it. Scratches along the walls. Slow, deliberate, moving from the back corner of the cabin toward the front. Something heavy pressed against the roof beams, shifting, groaning under the weight. "Open it," the voices whispered. "It's Christmas." I screamed, swinging the poker blindly, but there was nothing to hit. The scratches stopped. The air felt thick, oppressive, like it was closing in on me. I bolted for the door. As I flung it open, dozens of shadows detached themselves from the surrounding trees, moving toward the cabin with unnerving smoothness. They didn't run. They glided, stretching unnaturally over the snow, their forms twisting in ways that defied human anatomy. Faces, or what I assumed were faces, peeked from hoods and shadows, blank, featureless, yet I felt them watching. I sprinted to my car, lungs burning, boots slipping on the snow. Behind me, I heard laughter, low, hollow, echoing in perfect unison with the singing. My headlights caught something fleeting, a figure suspended a few feet above the ground, gliding across the snow like it had no weight. I slammed the door and locked it. The engine roared to life, but even as I sped down the trail, I could hear the chorus fading behind me, still singing, still circling. When I finally reached the highway hours later, the voices stopped. The forest behind me was silent again. I never returned to that cabin. I never camped alone on Christmas again. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear faint singing, off-key, overlapping, impossible, carried on the wind, waiting for someone foolish enough to celebrate Christmas alone in the woods. The lantern that walked. I used to think Christmas camping trips were supposed to be magical, soft snow, crisp air, the quiet peace of a forest blanketed in white. I learned the hard way that magic isn't always good. Some magic is sharp, cold, and alive in ways you don't want to meet. This happened in December 2019. I was 27, burnt out from a year of late-night shifts, and desperate to escape people and noise for a few days. I'd booked a solo winter camping trip at a remote site deep in the forest, about 4 hours from my apartment. The site had primitive cabins, a fire pit, and little else. Perfect, I thought, for a Christmas I could spend alone, warm by a fire and surrounded by snow. I arrived on December 23rd around 2:45 p.m. Snow had been falling all day, covering everything in a thick, untouched blanket. The forest was heavy with pines, their branches sagging under the weight. The air smelled sharp, like ice and pine needles, with a faint, metallic tang I couldn't place. My car crunched along the narrow trail, the only tracks in sight my own. I reached the campsite at 3:10 p.m. My cabin was small, log-built, and looked abandoned for months. I set my backpack down and walked to the fire pit to see if any wood had been left behind. There was plenty, but I noticed something strange. A small, rusted lantern sat at the edge of the clearing, swinging slightly even though there was no wind. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the previous camper had left it. I got inside my cabin, started a fire, and settled in. By 5:45 p.m., the sun had dipped behind the trees, and the forest had become a wall of dark, shifting shadows. The lantern glowed faintly from the corner of my eye. I shook my head. Just an old lantern, I muttered. By 7:15 p.m., I was cooking dinner and watching the fire flicker. That's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic crunching, not far from the cabin, in the snow. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They circled the cabin, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. I froze, heart hammering. "Hello?" I called out, my voice weak in the stillness. No answer, just the crunching circling. At 9:02 p.m., the lantern flickered and moved. It wasn't swinging, it was walking, slowly, across the snow toward me. My mind screamed at me. There was no one holding it, no strings, no footprints leading to it. Yet there it was, inching closer, glowing faintly through the night. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the lantern. The beam caught something behind it, a shadow. Tall, thin, impossibly straight, moving in rhythm with the lantern. No face, no features, just a black silhouette against the snow. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door. My chest heaved and sweat prickled my skin despite the cold. The lantern paused outside and then a voice came. Low, calm, whispered. "Merry Christmas," it said. I couldn't respond. I couldn't move. The lantern lifted slightly into the air, as if held by invisible hands, and moved to the window. I could see its faint glow against the snow, and the shadow behind it stretched unnaturally long, warping as though the trees themselves were bending. I grabbed my keys, my flashlight, anything I could use as a weapon. The lantern turned slowly, almost deliberately, its glow shining directly on me through the window. Then, for a single second, I thought I saw eyes, bright yellow, reflecting the light. At 11:49 p.m., I ran, slipping, sliding across the snow, ignoring the pain in my hands and legs. The lantern followed, floating effortlessly behind me. Every time I glanced back, it was closer, and behind it the shadow shifted, bending, gliding, defying the shape of a human body. I reached my car at 12:01 a.m., Christmas morning, and jumped inside, fumbling with the keys. My headlights illuminated the clearing. The lantern was still there, hovering near the cabin, swinging slightly as if waving goodbye. The shadow vanished into the trees. I didn't stop driving until the sun rose. Hours later, I finally felt safe, but the memory of that lantern, its slow, deliberate movement, the shadow gliding behind it, has never left me. Every winter around Christmas, I dream of it. Glowing in the snow, floating silently, waiting for the next camper foolish enough to think they can be alone.